A flight attendant refused to give a shivering teen a blanket. Seconds later, he was wrapped in the emergency slide by landing, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He clutched his arms and begged for warmth while the attendant laughed, holding the blanket just out of reach. Subscribe if you believe no kindness should ever be denied to the helpless. The call button above Seat 23A blinked softly, a subtle plea in the cold air. 16-year-old Evan Mercer sat hunched near the window, his thin gray hoodie barely enough to contain the tremors rippling through his arms. He rubbed his palms together, breath visible in small puffs as he stared out at the icy wing of the aircraft. The flight from Valeport to Harlington had already been delayed by an hour, and the cabin felt more like a meat locker than a passenger plane. The air conditioning was blasting without mercy, and despite the hushed complaints rippling across the rows, no action had been taken. Across the narrow aisle, flight attendant Greg Harlow leaned lazily against the beverage cart. He was mid-conversation with another male attendant, stocky with a sharp buzz cut and a name tag that read Royce, laughing softly about something irrelevant to the needs of the passengers. In his arms, Greg held a stack of navy blue blankets, still in their plastic wrapping. Evan waited patiently as the light blinked above his seat, his fingers now curled under his thighs for warmth. After a few moments, Greg finally turned his head, eyes falling on the glowing button. He sighed heavily, clearly annoyed, and pushed off the cart. With a practiced smirk, he sauntered over, stopping just beside Evan's row. "You rang," he said flatly, his voice soaked in boredom. Hi," Evan began, his voice thin from the cold. "Sorry, I was just wondering. Could I have one of the blankets, please?" "I'm really cold." Greg glanced down at the boy with a look of exaggerated pity, then chuckled, turning his head toward Royce, who was watching with vague amusement. "Blankets, huh?" he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Sorry, kid, they're for premium passengers only." He tapped the bundle against his thigh for emphasis, making a show of it. Evan's shoulders sank slightly. "Oh," he said softly, looking down at the floor. "Okay. Sorry Greg didn't bother to respond." He turned back to Royce, muttering something under his breath that made the other attendant laugh. A few rows back, a man in a black wool coat raised his eyes from his book, his brow furrowed. Another passenger, seated in the aisle seat directly behind Evan, shifted uncomfortably in his chair but said nothing. No one did. The silence was heavier than the cold. Alan Mercer, seated directly beside his son, had watched the entire exchange. He didn't move, didn't speak. He merely tightened his jaw and slowly exhaled through his nose. A calm exterior wrapped the quiet storm behind his eyes. He glanced at the stack of blankets still clutched in Greg's hands, then at the empty first-class section visible through the open curtain, at least 5 vacant seats, each with their own untouched comfort bundle. Greg returned to the beverage cart, chuckling again as he pointed discreetly toward Evan. "Some kids just love drama," he said under his breath, shaking his head. Alan heard it. He heard everything. Evan curled tighter into himself, pulling the edge of his hoodie over his fingers. He didn't complain again. Alan remained still, his fingers resting lightly on the spiral notebook in his lap, which until now had been filled with notes from the aeronautical safety conference he had just attended in Valeport. His pen hadn't moved since they boarded, but his mind had. He looked at his son, at the colorless lips, at the goosebumps rising like braille on the boy's forearms. There was a tightness in his chest, not panic, not helplessness. It was something colder, sharper. He glanced toward Greg, who was now sipping from a paper cup, still holding those blankets like a trophy. Alan thought about the flight delay, the flight manifest he'd glanced at while boarding, the specific airline policies he knew by memory, and the protocols Greg had already broken. He knew the safety temperature threshold for long-haul flights. He knew the range of camera angles available on standard commercial aircrafts. Most importantly, he knew that a single mistreated passenger could be the fulcrum for toppling a protected system. if you applied the right pressure at the right time. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to scold. Not yet. Nearby, passengers kept their eyes low. Whether from fear of confrontation or quiet guilt, no one wanted to be the first to speak. A few glanced at Alan, perhaps expecting him to lodge a formal complaint. He didn't. He simply gave them a polite nod and returned his gaze forward, as though he were merely another tired father waiting to land. But behind that gaze, the calculation had already begun. The engines hummed with dull constancy. The cabin lights flickered slightly as the plane began a shallow ascent. Alan felt the weight of the moment, the heaviness of restraint. A younger man might have burst with fury, but Alan knew better. Fury burns fast. Precision lasts longer. Greg passed by again, blanket still in tow, and this time didn't even look at Evan. Alan watched him go, then gently tapped his pen against the notebook. He wrote 3 things: the time, the interaction, and the name on Greg's badge. He had learned long ago that patience can be the sharpest form of revenge. "Please, sir," Evan murmured, his voice barely louder than the hum of the engines. "Just 1 blanket." Greg Harlow didn't stop walking at first. He moved casually down the narrow aisle, one arm curled around a stack of fresh blankets pressed against his chest, the other swaying with each step as though this were just another easy day in the skies. Then, with a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, he turned back and looked over his shoulder at the boy huddled by the window. Evan sat slouched forward, his hoodie pulled tight around his face, his arms wrapped across his chest like a makeshift cocoon. The blue tint of the overhead lighting washed out the pink from his cheeks, and his lips had begun to lose color. His hands trembled as he rubbed them together, searching for warmth that wasn't there. Greg stepped closer with mock sympathy on his face, crouching slightly to make eye contact. "I told you, these aren't for economy dreamers," he said, chuckling as though delivering a joke among friends. Then he stood upright and continued down the aisle, not even glancing at the row behind. A few passengers exchanged uncertain looks. The woman, sitting diagonally across, shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable, while an older man in 18D leaned toward the aisle and muttered, "That's not right." But nobody said anything louder than a whisper. No one stood up. The cabin remained locked in a silence that felt colder than the air swirling through the vents. Alan Mercer, seated beside his son, turned slowly toward the window. His jaw tightened, his gaze distant. His hands rested on his knees, unmoving. He didn't speak, didn't sigh, didn't challenge Greg. But inside, a calculation was already beginning. A quiet storm of numbers, patterns, probabilities. He had seen power abused before, in boardrooms, in systems, in the very codes he used to design airline safety frameworks. But never this close to home. Not like this. The temperature inside the cabin dipped further as the flight leveled out at cruising altitude. Tiny crystals clung to the edges of the window. Evan's breath came out in faint, shaky puffs. His knees bounced beneath his tray table in a rhythm that wasn't quite voluntary. Alan removed his jacket and gently placed it over his son's shoulders, but it wasn't enough. The boy's fingers were ice to the touch. Greg returned 15 minutes later, this time wheeling the beverage cart with exaggerated cheer. "Drinks, water, juice. For our premium guests, we also have sparkling." He stopped beside Evan's row and glanced down again. "Still cold, huh?" Alan's voice was level. "My son's clearly in distress." "I'm requesting a medical check." Greg blinked. "Medical?" He scoffed and laughed under his breath, his tone thick with disbelief. "Sir, the cabin temperature is within standard operating range. If your kid's cold, maybe next time book a better seat." Alan didn't flinch. "That's a refusal of a medical request." "You understand the implications?" Greg leaned in just a little, lowering his voice so the surrounding rows couldn't hear. "I understand you're in coach. And that means you get coach treatment. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." He straightened and rolled the cart forward as if nothing had happened. Alan sat still, but his eyes followed Greg's every move. His mind wasn't dwelling on the insult or the power play. It was dissecting the interaction for evidence, patterns, protocol violations. A part of him noted the exact time. Another filed away the names from Greg's nameplate, the badge on his chest, the body language, the witnesses. "Dad," Evan whispered through chattering teeth. "I'll be okay." Alan looked at his son, brushing the boy's damp hair away from his forehead. "You shouldn't have to be," he said softly. Across the aisle, the man from 18D pretended to sip from his cup while glancing toward them. He looked like he wanted to say something, his lips parted, but no words came. Greg returned moments later and continued his rounds, laughing with another attendant at the front of the cabin. Alan's ears picked up the fragments. "He looked like a frozen burrito, didn't he? Maybe someone should tell him economy's not a spa." The flight continued, the noise of the engines dull and constant. Alan opened his laptop, but he didn't check emails. He accessed an internal software tool few knew existed, a safety compliance node designed for maintenance inspectors. As a former systems auditor, he still had credentials that hadn't expired. He didn't access any restricted documents, not yet, but he tested the signal strength and confirmed what he suspected. This aircraft's maintenance system used a public network bridge to its non-critical systems. Greg wouldn't understand that. Most attendants wouldn't. He closed the laptop and tapped his pen once against the tray. His eyes flicked back to the ceiling vent, then to Evan's trembling form, then to the empty first-class seats barely 10 rows ahead, each stocked with plush, folded blankets. Foreshadowing filled the space between his thoughts. He wasn't just angry, he was preparing, because he knew something Greg didn't. On an airplane, everything is recorded: data, dialogue, movement, error. It was only a matter of knowing where to look and when to strike. From behind, another passenger sneezed violently, and Greg called out a snide, "Bless you, hope it's not the plague." Laughter followed from one of his co-workers. Alan didn't laugh. He reached under the seat, pulled out a small notebook, and wrote 4 words. Second refusal. Medical request. His eyes lingered on the pen's ink as it dried. The line was simple, clinical, and yet full of weight. He had just created a paper trail, one of many to come. He then reached for his phone and sent a brief message to his firm's dormant alert address, a dormant address built into every test system they'd created over the years. Stand by. Possible incident developing. 47B. It was a quiet signal. No bells, no alarms, just a line of text waiting to be matched to data. As the cabin lights dimmed slightly for evening mode, Greg passed again. Evan flinched. Alan didn't move. He simply looked at the man, expression blank, then turned back toward the icy window, where the frost danced faintly along the rim. Inside, the tension was growing. The calculation had begun. The higher they fly on arrogance, the harder they fall when truth takes the controls. Turbulence hit the plane with a sudden jolt, shaking overhead bins and sending plastic cups skittering across tray tables. Gasps and startled murmurs rippled through the cabin as the fasten seatbelt signs blinked on with a soft chime. A beverage can rolled beneath a seat, and a child began to cry from somewhere near the back. Greg Harlow's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened. Cabin crew, take your positions." He didn't sound calm, he sounded annoyed. Greg stomped up the aisle, muttering under his breath about drama queens and nervous flyers. His usually smug demeanor was edged now with irritation. As he moved past row 18, where Alan Mercer sat beside his shivering son, Evan, Greg's shoulder knocked lightly against an armrest and caused a thin plastic ID badge to fall from his belt loop, unnoticed by the crewman himself. Alan saw it land on the floor near the galley door, spinning once on its clip before settling face up. No one else seemed to notice. Alan's instincts kicked in, the same instincts that had once helped him uncover a federal pilot fraud ring. He gently shifted in his seat, murmuring to Evan, "I'll be right back," and pretended to reach for his bag. With a smooth motion, he retrieved the badge, flipping it over briefly. Gregory T. Harlow, Cabin Operations, it read, along with the 6-digit employee code. Alan's eyes lingered for a second longer, memorizing the number and the barcode pattern printed along the edge. Then, with practiced ease, he slid the badge between the pages of his spiral notebook and returned to his seat. Outside the window, lightning flickered distantly in the clouds, casting quick flashes over the wing. Beside him, Evan stirred weakly, his lips pale and his fingers curled against his body for warmth. Alan's jaw clenched. He took a slow breath, the way he had learned to do in high-stakes audit meetings when patience was the only weapon that mattered. When the turbulence eased and the plane returned to a smoother course, Greg passed by again without looking at them. Alan unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. "Back in a minute," he said softly. He walked calmly toward the lavatory but stopped near the service bulkhead. There, behind the closed beverage station, the plane's structural paneling included a locked maintenance interface. Alan reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and held it low near the panel's RFID reader, one of the older models he had helped design for internal use years ago. The phone vibrated faintly as the portal connected. The cabin was quiet now, except for the low hum of engines and the occasional cough. Alan tapped through encrypted menus with expert speed, navigating beyond passenger access levels. His fingers flew across the screen as he entered Greg's ID number into the internal personnel lookup. The result loaded in seconds. Greg's profile appeared, along with several embedded report summaries, internal complaints, warning letters, passenger dissatisfaction logs, and co-worker assessments. Alan scrolled quickly. 6 complaints in total. 3 from passengers accusing Greg of rude or discriminatory behavior. 2 from crew members reporting hostile work environment. 1 from a trainee who claimed Greg withheld safety equipment during drills as a joke. All of them marked resolved internally with no external escalation. Alan's expression darkened. The pattern was undeniable. Greg wasn't just rude, he had a record, and someone in corporate had been sweeping it under the rug. Alan leaned against the wall of the lavatory stall, the confined space lit only by the pale blue overhead light. He stared down at his phone, the data glowing on the screen like a map to a hidden rot. He had spent his career enforcing accountability in high-risk systems, planes, trains, automated control platforms. But this was personal. His son had been denied basic care, mocked, and left trembling from cold by a man who had been warned, documented, and protected. This wasn't just a blanket. It was a weapon of power. He closed the portal, locked the phone, and slid it back into his pocket. When he stepped out into the aisle, the sound of the engines grew louder again. Passengers were settling in. Greg stood near the front, chatting and laughing with another flight attendant as if nothing had happened. Alan walked past him slowly, resisting the urge to make eye contact. Back at his seat, Evan looked up. His father's face was calm, almost unreadable, but there was a new sharpness behind his eyes. A decision had been made. Alan sat, opened his notebook, and pretended to read. In truth, he was replaying everything in his mind: the badge, the file, the pattern of misconduct, and the blank stares of accountability. Outside, the sky was dark now. A velvet wall stretched from wingtip to wingtip. He looked through the glass, his breath briefly fogging the cold surface, and whispered under it. Some lessons need to be taught at 30,000 feet. Greg Harlow didn't even pause as he dropped a tray with a dull clatter onto the fold-down table in front of Evan. "Here you go, gourmet dining at its finest," he muttered, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. A few chuckles slipped from the galley, but they carried no warmth, only the hollow echo of forced camaraderie. Evan, still curled into himself, barely glanced at the lukewarm meal. His hands trembled as he tried to lift the plastic cover, the chill in the cabin biting deeper into his bones. Alan Mercer took a slow breath and reached across the aisle, tapping the attendant call button again. This time, when Greg turned, Alan met his eyes directly. "Could I please have a cup of warm water?" Alan asked, his tone level and composed. "My son's fingers are stiff. He's having trouble with his circulation." Greg cocked his head, exaggerated his confusion, and narrowed his eyes. "What's next?" he said with a grin that didn't touch his eyes. "A heater?" A few passengers glanced over. One man in a business suit frowned and muttered under his breath. Another young man seated 2 rows ahead turned and stared for a few seconds, clearly debating whether to say something. But the moment passed, and silence returned to the cabin, thick, uncomfortable, and heavy. Alan said nothing in response. He simply pulled his phone a few inches higher, angling the camera just enough to frame Greg's smirk and the full exchange. The device barely moved, and from the outside, he looked like any father scrolling through messages or reviewing a presentation. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Greg walked off, laughing under his breath as he passed the beverage cart. Alan's fingers moved quickly now, tapping into the secure interface of a company program only a handful of people in the world had access to. It wasn't standard issue, it was proprietary, designed and deployed by his firm SkySecure Analytics for internal investigations into aviation incidents. It had never been used during a flight by one of the developers themselves. Until now. He typed in the flight number, seat code, timestamp, and a single identifier, CABIN47B. Then he pressed a sequence of commands. The phone vibrated once, subtly, confirming that the safety flag had been activated. This wasn't a normal passenger complaint, this was a regulatory red tag. In under 5 seconds, the aircraft's internal systems would log a report into the airline's compliance database, and an alert would be sent to the oversight terminal at Kreslin Air's main operations hub in Denver. It would then copy itself to a dormant backup system designed for cross-agency review, a system Alan had helped test 2 years prior. He didn't stop there. With the Wi-Fi signal holding steady, Alan began uploading the recorded footage directly to a private cloud folder locked behind 2-factor encryption. He input his secure credentials, bypassing the usual data sync limit. The feed showed Greg, smirking and dismissive, standing less than 5 feet from a clearly freezing teenager. Each frame a testament to negligence. Each second, another data point. Across the cabin, Greg continued to hand out trays with mechanical indifference. But there was an edge to his movements now. A twitch in the jaw. A glance toward the row where Evan sat. Perhaps he could feel the mood shifting. Perhaps not. Arrogance, Alan had learned, often dulled perception. As the meal service continued, Alan watched carefully. A man in a blazer whispered something to his seatmate, both of them throwing glances toward Greg. Even the older gentleman near the emergency exit who hadn't spoken a word. The entire flight shook his head slowly. Greg didn't care, or maybe he didn't realize. Alan slid his phone into his lap, screen angled upward. He tapped a hidden icon, a protocol reserved for verified internal monitors. The feature was meant to test remote compliance scenarios, but Alan repurposed it. Once activated, it sent a passive synchronization signal to the aircraft's black box duplicate storage. Cabin camera feeds, normally locked until post-incident review, would now mirror themselves to a sandboxed audit environment stored off-site. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even hidden in the fine print. It just wasn't designed to be used like this. The signal blinked twice. The sync had begun. Alan's heart rate remained steady. Every move was intentional. Every file had its place. Outside the aircraft, the sky was endless black, dotted with distant stars. But inside, tension thickened. A child silently shook from cold while a uniformed man joked about heaters. A plane full of passengers pretended not to notice until it was safe to look. Alan knew the pattern. He'd written the pattern. Greg stopped at the front of the cabin and leaned against the galley wall, sipping from a metal thermos. Probably warm coffee, Alan noted. a small act that suddenly felt like an insult. Evan shifted, pulling his knees up and wrapping his arms around them. "Dad," he said quietly, "it's really cold." "I know," Alan replied, gently placing a hand over his son's. "I'm fixing it." Greg reappeared minutes later, this time without a tray. He sauntered toward the back, catching eyes as he went. His shoulders squared, chin lifted, a man still under the illusion that he controlled the room. Alan didn't blink. He tapped one final button on the upload interface. A confirmation box appeared. Incident stream live. The files would now archive themselves across 3 security nodes. The trap had been set. Greg thought he was taunting a powerless man. He didn't know that every cruel smirk, every dismissive sneer, every petty denial had just become evidence, documented, time-stamped, and forwarded to an oversight board Alan had helped design. Justice was no longer a question of if, it was just a matter of timing. Alan looked once more at the passengers seated nearby, quiet observers now waiting. The cabin may have appeared calm, but beneath it, something had already begun to unravel. And as Alan adjusted his glasses and stared down the aisle, his mind clear, he thought, arrogance often blinds men to the traps they set for themselves. Evan's body trembled violently, his fingers curled inward like frozen claws as he rocked slightly in his seat. The thin hoodie clung to him, damp with cold sweat, his cheeks pale and eyes glassy. His breath came in rapid bursts, and a slight wheezing sound began to emerge from his throat. Alan's hand gripped his son's shoulder, trying to give him what little warmth he could. The father's eyes darted across the cabin, looking for help, or, at the very least, decency. A middle-aged man from 3 rows back unbuckled and stepped into the aisle. He wore a dark sweater, neatly pressed slacks, and carried the calm authority of someone used to critical situations. "I'm Dr. Nolan Pierce," he said, his voice clear and measured as he approached. "I specialize in emergency medicine. This boy is not just cold, he's showing signs of hypothermia." Greg, returning from the galley with a plastic cup of juice in hand, scoffed. "Doctor, is it?" "Appreciate the concern, but I've been up and down this aisle all flight. The cabin's within acceptable range." "He's shaking uncontrollably," Dr. Pierce replied, kneeling beside Evan. "His skin is cold to the touch, he's confused, and he's barely responsive." "That's not acceptable range. He needs warmth." Now, Greg's lips curled into a dismissive smirk. "Passengers always find something to complain about." Maybe he should have dressed better. Alan slowly stood. His movements were deliberate, not rushed, and he addressed Greg with a tone that was sharper than steel but calm enough to make people listen. "He's not complaining. He's suffering, and you're the only one standing in the way of a solution." "I'm standing by protocol," Greg snapped, stepping forward. "This isn't a crisis." "You want to cause panic over a kid shivering in a hoodie?" "Come on," Dr. Pierce rose to his feet, no longer gentle. "I'm a licensed physician. If you continue to ignore this, it's no longer negligence, it's endangerment." Greg's eyes narrowed. He turned sharply and stormed up the aisle, muttering under his breath, "Overreacting civilians." His voice trailed off behind the curtain that separated economy from the cockpit corridor. Alan looked around. Passengers had started paying attention. Some already held phones in their laps, screens dimmed but cameras rolling. The cabin's silence was thick with unease. Alan took a breath and spoke in a voice that filled the rows. "Everyone, please stay calm, but record everything." Phones lifted instantly. Lights blinked to life. The quiet clicks and hums of cameras became a silent chorus of defiance. Moments later, Greg burst back through the curtain, his face red, his steps short and angry. "You're all violating airline policy. Put those phones away right now." One man didn't even flinch. Another zoomed in closer. Greg's panic was showing. He stepped toward the nearest passenger with a phone, hand raised as if to swat the device from their grip. But then, a piercing chime rang out from Alan's seat. a crisp, sharp tone that silenced the aisle. Greg froze mid-step, confused. Alan held up his phone. The screen glowed bright blue with a flashing aviation symbol. The flight had just changed. That, Alan said clearly, was a confirmation tone. Greg's brow furrowed. Confirmation of what? The safety flag, Alan replied, his voice steady but low, like thunder under ice. My alert went through. Greg blinked, a flicker of realization in his eyes, but it came too late. Across the cabin, murmurs began to rise as passengers looked at one another, confused but suddenly aware that something far bigger was happening. Alan turned the screen around to show the symbol, letting everyone see the blinking confirmation light. This aircraft's safety systems now recognize an in-cabin escalation event. Your behavior has been flagged at the federal level. Greg took a step back. What are you talking about? He muttered, his voice quieter now, unsteady. What I'm talking about, Alan said, slipping his phone back into his pocket, is that your actions have been officially logged, not just here, but at Cressland's central oversight servers. There was no bravado in his voice, no showy anger, just fact, cold, precise fact. What Greg didn't know, what no one else yet saw, was that the moment Alan triggered that safety flag, the cabin's internal surveillance footage was duplicated, encrypted, and sent to external audit servers, bypassing in-house filters. Every second Greg had spent taunting a freezing teenager had just been time-stamped, backed up, and sealed for federal review. Across the aisle, Dr. Pierce pulled out his own phone and began speaking into it quietly. Documenting signs of hypothermia. Temperature in cabin feels below standard. Witnessing potential misconduct by flight crew, Greg's face had drained of color. He looked to the rear as if hoping for backup, but saw only the stoic stares of passengers who were no longer on his side. His voice cracked as he turned to Alan one final time. You think you've done something smart? You think this will end well for you? Alan didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His reply was colder than the air around them. He didn't just request justice, he engineered it mid-air. Greg Harlow's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Sit down now, sir, he barked, pointing a stiff finger toward Alan Mercer. Interfering with crew operations is a federal offense. Alan didn't flinch. He slowly lowered himself back into his seat, never breaking eye contact. His phone remained steady in his hand, still recording. The glow from the screen cast a soft light over his composed features, sharp against the backdrop of panicked murmurs and stiffened passengers. Greg mistook Alan's calm for surrender, but in truth, Alan was simply calculating. His posture relaxed, but his mind moved quickly, methodically. He knew the rulebook better than Greg ever would, because he had helped write it. Across the aisle, a businessman adjusted his tie nervously. A teenage boy reached for his father's hand. The cabin had shifted. It wasn't just cold from the lingering air, it was heavy with anticipation. Every passenger sensed the balance of power tilting, even if they couldn't quite name it yet. Then a soft electronic chime rippled through the air, slicing the silence. The intercom came to life with a calm voice from the cockpit. Cabin crew, please prepare for descent. Alan's eyes narrowed. He looked instinctively toward the wing. No flaps, no drop in altitude, no descent. He understood instantly. This wasn't a landing message. This was a signal. A coded prompt passed from the captain, responding to the silent safety flag Alan had activated earlier. The aircraft was still cruising at 32,000 feet. The captain had received the alert, and now the system Alan had designed was responding. Greg's expression shifted. His confident smirk faltered as his eyes darted toward the cockpit. The intercom's blinking light signaled an internal call. This one for him. A beat passed. He hesitated, lips parting slightly, unsure whether to ignore it. The flight attendant standing at the rear galley gave him a questioning glance. Greg snapped into motion. Cover me, he muttered tightly, shoving the service cart aside and pacing quickly toward the front of the aircraft. Alan watched him go, his face unreadable but his pulse steady. Every step Greg took down that narrow aisle was another step into a reckoning he didn't even know was coming. The irony was thick. Greg, who believed he was asserting control, was walking straight into a trap built by the very passenger he tried to humiliate. Inside the cockpit, the captain's face was stoic, the lines around his mouth tight. He didn't look up when Greg entered. "You received something?" Greg asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. The first officer glanced at the monitor where a split screen displayed a live cabin feed. One section showed Alan Mercer sitting calmly, still recording. Another showed a zoomed-in frame of Greg earlier, holding a blanket inches from the boy and smirking. "Yes," the captain replied, still not looking at him. "We did." And corporate did, too. "You've been flagged," Greg swallowed. "It's not what it looks like." "That man's exaggerating. He's been causing trouble since takeoff." The captain finally turned, eyes like flint. "That man is Alan Mercer. You really don't know who's on your flight, do you?" Greg blinked. The name didn't register. "He's not just a systems engineer," the captain continued. "He helped design the onboard safety protocols you're supposed to be following." Greg's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. His knees felt like they'd lost their strength. The first officer zoomed the video feed. The boy in the footage looked pale. His lips tinged blue. Greg's voice played clearly. "These aren't for economy dreamers." The silence in the cockpit was suffocating. Then the captain added, almost softly, "You've made this flight a liability." Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers whispered. One of them, a gray-haired man in a sports jacket, leaned across the aisle to another and said, "They're not coming down yet." That message was a warning. Alan remained still, gaze fixed on the cockpit door. He didn't need to see what was happening inside to know the effect his alert had triggered. The internal audit system was already indexing every second of the flight's camera feed. That data would be archived and copied to external servers by the time they touched down. Greg re-emerged 10 minutes later, his face drained of color. He avoided eye contact, trying to mask the tremble in his fingers by clutching the service cart a little too tightly. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by forced professionalism. The passengers saw through it. The boy beside Alan stirred, resting his head on his father's shoulder. Alan gently pulled the hood of the hoodie back over Evan's head, the motion calm and precise. "Everything's under control," Greg announced, his voice too loud, too strained. He turned to move down the aisle, his steps shaky. His eyes darted from phone to phone. Almost every passenger had one pointed at him now. Greg forced a half smile, nodding as though nothing had happened. But Alan knew better. The flight's black box was no longer recording just turbulence and coordinates. It was recording every word, every breath, every policy violation in high definition. He didn't speak, didn't rise. His work had been quiet, invisible, precise. Greg had underestimated a father. He had underestimated a mind built on systems and consequences. And now, those systems were responding. Greg moved past their row, not daring to look Alan in the eye. Alan tilted his head slightly, just enough to see him vanish behind the beverage cart once more. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence, one filled with consequence. Justice needed more than exposure. It needed demonstration. Greg slammed the cockpit door behind him, breathing harder than the situation demanded. The confined space smelled faintly of burnt coffee and plastic, a sterile contrast to the tension crackling in the air. The captain, a stoic man in his early 50s named Roy Mathers, didn't even glance back. His eyes remained locked on the instrument panel, fingers adjusting a dial as if the act helped him process what he had just seen scroll across his flight dashboard. Cabin incident flag, category yellow, seat 47B. "Talk," Captain Mathers said without turning. His voice was low even, but carried the authority of someone used to steering through storms far worse than weather. Greg straightened his posture, attempting to regain some form of composure. "It's nothing, sir. Just a passenger overreacting. Economy class. Guy's upset I didn't give his kid a blanket. He's making a show of it." The first officer, Lieutenant Avery Dean, swiveled his chair slowly toward Greg. Unlike the captain, Avery didn't mask his concern. His expression was strained, lips pressed into a tight line, brow furrowed with skepticism. He reached toward the side panel and tapped a screen to access the cabin feed from minutes ago. Greg's eyes followed the movement, panic flickering behind the forced calm. "Look, I was trying to maintain policy," he rushed out. "We have limited resources, and that guy, he's manipulating the passengers." "Recording everything. Let's see what you call policy," Avery said, his voice clipped as the video loaded. The feed showed Greg standing casually with a bundle of blankets in hand, smirking as he looked down at a visibly shivering teenager. The boy's hands were rubbed raw against each other, his lips blue-tinged. Greg held a blanket inches away, then turned away with exaggerated disinterest. The footage continued, Greg laughing with another flight attendant, mockingly mimicking the boy's shaking shoulders. No sound, but the gestures were unmistakable. The captain finally turned. His eyes bore into Greg with a slow burning intensity that forced silence into the room. "You just turned a flight into a liability," Mathers said quietly, yet the weight behind his words felt heavier than the plane itself. "And now, I have a cabin full of passengers who've witnessed it." Greg opened his mouth, but nothing came. There were no words left to manipulate, no tone left to twist into authority. At that very moment, back in row 47B, Alan Mercer's thumb tapped the final keystroke of a message sent through the airline's public Wi-Fi system. "Prepare escalation protocol for cabin 47B. Audio and video en route." His firm, SkySecure Analytics, received the message within seconds. A silent, secure server activated and began pulling data from the onboard wireless stream. Cabin camera feeds, audio logs, device pings, all were time-stamped, flagged, and automatically prepared for internal case review. In the cockpit, the silence thickened as the captain leaned forward and pressed a discreet intercom button. His voice sounded calm but steely. "Cabin crew, please prepare for descent." It was a lie. They were still 30 minutes from descent. But the coded announcement wasn't meant for altitude management, it was protocol. A prearranged signal to acknowledge the flag had reached corporate. The flight was now under live oversight. Greg blinked. "We're not descending yet," he mumbled. Mathers didn't respond. He turned back to the controls, but Avery stood. "You're excused from duty until we land," he said flatly. I need to finish my rounds," Greg protested weakly. "No, you need to return to your jump seat and wait for post-flight protocol," Mathers added without looking up. Greg hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door, then nodded stiffly and walked out, closing the cockpit behind him with far less force than before. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The passengers, already buzzing with quiet conversations and glances, hushed as Greg reappeared. The forced smile on his face was fragile, a thin shell attempting to hide the storm behind his eyes. He moved down the aisle, posture stiff, sweat beading at his temples despite the cool air. Alan noticed instantly. The mask of arrogance had cracked. Evan, wrapped in a jacket loaned from a fellow passenger, looked up at his father. Alan didn't speak. He simply gave a small nod, calm, controlled, confident. As Greg passed them, he paused. "Everything's under control," he said, his voice trying to find its old rhythm of command. But it wavered. Alan met his eyes, unblinking. Behind him, passengers watched, their phones discreetly angled. The balance of power had shifted, and Greg felt it in his bones. He moved on down the aisle, hands slightly trembling. Back in the cockpit, a notification blinked on Avery's screen. External investigation initiated. Internal data crossfeeds underway. Live audit in progress. And in the cabin, Control didn't belong to the one wearing the uniform anymore, because the thing about control, it belongs to those who earn it, not those who abuse it. The teen shivered from the cold, his lips turning pale as the flight attendant mocked him, pointing at the blanket like it was a game. No one expected that humiliation to turn into reckoning by landing. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here. The moment was sudden, a blur of motion driven by panic and desperation. As Alan raised his phone and spoke, his voice calm but firm. Everyone saw what happened. Let's make sure no one forgets. The cabin seemed to freeze. Passengers' eyes darted between the two men, breaths held as if the air itself hesitated. Greg's face twisted, his forced professionalism cracking into raw frustration. He surged forward, one arm outstretched, fingers curled like claws, aiming straight for the phone in Alan's hand. The sudden jolt of turbulence struck at the worst possible second, tilting the floor beneath Greg's feet and sending a tray from the galley skidding across the aisle. Greg's foot landed on it, slid, and twisted out from under him. He stumbled hard toward the front of the cabin, arms flailing as he lost all control of his balance. Time slowed as his shoulders slammed against the wall near the emergency door. There was a distinct metallic clunk. Greg's elbow had struck the assist panel just below the emergency slide housing. Alan's instinct took over. In one fluid movement, he reached past the staggering flight attendant and pressed the illuminated manual assist switch. Not in anger, but with the cold, deliberate precision of a man who had weighed every variable. The result was immediate and thunderous. Hish! A roaring hiss exploded from the cabin wall. The emergency slide, packed tightly within the door's compartment, blasted open with such violent force that it struck Greg square in the chest before fully uncoiling. The thick, rubberized fabric enveloped him mid-fall, wrapping tightly around his shoulders and torso like a python made of industrial-grade canvas. His shout of protest became muffled as the slide's coiled mass dragged him backward, pinning him half-seated and stunned against the doorframe. Gasps echoed throughout the cabin. A child, somewhere near row 9, let out a startled yelp. Phones lifted into the air, camera lenses refocusing. The passengers had been quiet observers until now, but this moment, bizarre and unforgettable, would be captured in full clarity. Several were already streaming. Alan didn't move. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply stood there, his arm lowering slowly after releasing the switch, his face expressionless, his gaze steady and cold. Greg flailed. "Get it off me!" "I can't move. Someone help! Get it off!" he shouted, but his voice was partially muted by the heavy folds of the slide cocooned around him. He looked like a man wrapped in his own arrogance, now crushed by the same emergency system he had so flippantly disregarded earlier. Sir, you can't," another male attendant began, stepping forward from the galley, panic in his eyes. Alan turned his head slightly, his tone still composed. "He tried to assault a passenger. You saw that. I. The attendant hesitated, eyes flicking to the many recording phones, then to Greg's pathetic, tangled form against the door. "I need to notify the cockpit." "You should," Alan replied, "immediately." For a few long seconds, no one moved. Then the overhead light chimed again. The intercom activated from the cockpit. The captain's voice crackled through, calm but firmer this time. "Cabin crew, please prepare the aircraft for immediate ground assistance." "Repeat, ground assistance is en route." "Maintain cabin order." Alan didn't break his gaze. The flight was still descending. The landing gear had deployed moments before Greg's fall, and the cabin lights were dimmed to prep for arrival. The emergency slide hadn't fully deployed outside the aircraft, only partially expanded within the interior housing. But it was enough, just enough, for the entire cabin to see what had happened. A symbol of safety and rescue had become the instrument of humiliation. Evan stirred beside his father, still bundled in the wool coat given by a fellow passenger. His lips trembled less now, though his body still shook. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from the cold. Alan placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. It's almost over. The man who had denied his son warmth was now smothered in the very fabric meant to save lives. Greg's muffled grunts and frantic squirming continued, but there was no dignity left in his struggle. The fabric constricted more as he writhed, the friction of movement making things worse. A sharp click came from behind, the cockpit door unlocking. 2 male crew supervisors entered, both grim-faced and clearly aware that the situation had spiraled beyond cabin management. One knelt to check Greg's condition. The other turned to Alan. "Sir, we'll need a statement after landing." "You'll have it," Alan replied without hesitation. "So, will the regulatory board?" The supervisor blinked but said nothing more. Throughout the cabin, the silence returned, heavy but filled with electric energy. Every passenger understood they had witnessed something rare, a balance of power shifting, not through rage or chaos, but through calculation and timing. Greg, once so smug and untouchable, was now bound not by policy, but by consequence. Alan remained standing, his posture calm, hands folded loosely before him. He made no further moves. He didn't need to. And as the last lurch of descent tugged the aircraft gently downward, he looked at the tangled mass of fabric and the writhing man inside it with the same cold calculation he had worn since takeoff. Sometimes fate doesn't need help, just a little nudge. The hiss of the emergency slide still echoed through the cabin when the plane's wheels finally screeched against the tarmac. The thud jolted passengers upright, their hands clenched to armrests, phones still aimed at the front where Greg Harlow lay, tangled, trapped and red-faced in the half-deployed chute. No one moved to help him. The silence was thick, an uneasy, stunned quiet, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. Then came the buzz of radios, the stomp of boots, and the unmistakable metallic clink of security buckles. Airport security officers boarded within seconds, cutting through the tension with practiced efficiency. Behind them, 2 paramedics pushed through with urgency, one already unzipping a thermal blanket pack. The lead officer, a thick-set man with a silver badge and dark, tired eyes, scanned the chaos, locking eyes with Alan Mercer. Alan didn't wait to be asked. Without a word, he stood, retrieved his phone, and held it out. "This is the footage," he said, his voice clear and calm despite the tremor in the air. "Cabin misconduct. Obstruction of medical aid. Physical endangerment." The officer took the phone, reviewing a few seconds of the video as Greg moaned behind them. He waved to his team. "Secure the flight attendant. We'll need a full incident report, all passenger videos, and witness statements." His tone left no room for argument. Greg's muffled protests rose in panic as security began to untangle him from the thick nylon folds of the emergency slide. "It was a mistake. The turbulence, it knocked me. He pressed the button on purpose." His eyes darted wildly, seeking sympathy, but found none. The passengers who had once passively endured his smug commands now watched in judgment. Some whispered, a few filmed. Others simply stared, their expressions hard. Evan, still pale, leaned against his father's side. A real blanket, now draped over his shoulders by the medic, gave him a fragile sense of warmth. His lips trembled, not from cold anymore, but from the strange mix of exhaustion and vindication coursing through him. He glanced up at his father, a flicker of awe behind his weary eyes. "Dad," he whispered softly, "did you plan that?" Alan glanced down, his features unreadable for a moment. Then a small, calculated smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. "Let's just say systems respond to inputs," he murmured, placing a steady hand on Evan's shoulder. Outside, the noise had begun to swell. Through the cabin windows, flashing lights lit the rainy tarmac in hues of red and blue. A crowd had gathered behind the security cordon, some holding phones aloft, others shouting questions that couldn't be heard over the engines. The news had already broken. Passengers had posted clips mid-air, Journalists had pounced before the tires even touched the ground. Greg was marched past them, now handcuffed and visibly shaking, his uniform rumpled and stained. His eyes, once sharp with smug superiority, were wide with disbelief. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some jeered, others just filmed. The officer escorting him muttered something into his radio, then nodded at the crew chief waiting outside. Allen stepped off the aircraft last, flanked by the flight security chief and 2 officers. Reporters pushed forward, microphones outstretched, cameras flashing in bursts of white. "Mr. Mercer, is it true you triggered the slide deliberately? Was your son denied medical attention? Did the airline try to cover it up?" Allen paused, facing the wall of noise. He didn't flinch, didn't scowl. Instead, he stood tall, letting the flashbulbs freeze the moment. "No one should freeze for asking kindness," he said clearly. That single sentence would ignite an industry-wide reckoning. The video of Greg wrapped in the emergency slide went viral before the plane's wheels even cooled on the tarmac. Within 48 hours, the incident had flooded social media. News outlets replayed the footage on loop, passengers cheering, Allen rising to speak, and Greg's clumsy lunge followed by the thunderous hiss of the slide trapping him like a punishment written in fabric. There was no context needed. The image alone told a story of humiliation, power overturned, and a quiet man's calm retaliation. Cresslin Air responded swiftly, but not with honesty. Their press release described the event as a mechanical malfunction and praised the crew for their quick thinking under pressure. The words were sterile, manufactured by legal and PR teams in rooms lined with whiteboards and coffee cups. But the world had already seen the truth. Dozens of passengers had posted their own recordings, capturing Greg's sneers, Evan's shivering, and Allen's soft but firm commands. Hashtags like #justice at 30K feet and #blanketboy surged across platforms. The airline's narrative drowned in a tidal wave of outrage. At SkySecure Analytics, Allen's team worked around the clock. Behind a locked conference room door, rows of monitors displayed time-stamped footage, data logs, and heat-mapped passenger sentiment based on phone recordings. Allen, though exhausted, was relentless. He didn't smile when the view counts climbed into the millions. He didn't flinch when reporters swarmed his neighborhood. He only focused on one thing, connecting what happened on that plane to something much larger. "Greg Harlow isn't the story," Allen said during a team debrief. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with precision. "He's the symptom. We're going after the system that protected him." His lead analyst, Darren, nodded and turned his screen toward the group. "There are 6 prior complaints tied to Greg's personnel file. Verbal abuse, racial remarks, even medical negligence, all marked as handled internally. No suspensions, no retraining. All signed off by one name, Douglas Sims Allen narrowed his eyes. Sims was a mid-level manager at Crestline, previously part of their cabin service oversight. "That's our crack in the hull," Allen muttered. "If Sims buried those reports, he enabled everything that happened on that flight." As SkySecure's report took shape, government regulators took notice. The Federal Aviation Oversight Bureau requested a copy of the preliminary findings. Allen's team didn't wait for permission. They published it publicly, embedding passenger testimonies, footage, and crew evaluations into a single, clean interface anyone could access. Overnight, the document exploded across forums, professional networks, and even international news. Headlines shifted from the blanket denial to questions about deeper negligence within Cresslin Air's management. Meanwhile, Evan recovered quietly at home. He sat wrapped in a thick throw blanket in their living room, surrounded by letters from strangers, handwritten cards, warm messages, even artwork sent by other teens. Some wrote about their own experiences being ignored or humiliated in public spaces. One note stood out to Evan. "You reminded the world that being cold shouldn't mean being invisible. Alan read it over his son's shoulder, his throat tightening slightly. But he said nothing. He never had to say much. That night, Alan declined 2 television interviews, 1 book deal proposal, and an offer to consult for a national ethics board. He wasn't interested in fame. "Facts speak louder than faces," he told Darren. "We stay on mission." But not everyone was backing down. At a union office downtown, Greg Harlow sat slouched in a plastic chair, his hands trembling slightly as his lawyer shuffled through papers. "They're painting you as the villain," the lawyer said, shaking his head. "But we have an angle. They activated the emergency slide, not you. That's unauthorized. We can claim reckless conduct. If we prove Alan Mercer triggered that slide manually, we can argue he created the danger, not you." Greg didn't reply at first. He looked at his hands. The internet had already made him a symbol, and not the kind people rallied behind. "It's his word against mine," he muttered. The lawyer leaned in. "Not if we control the courtroom narrative. Let's shift the blame. Let's raise questions. Doubt is all we need." Back at Sky Secure, Alan wasn't yet aware of the strategy brewing behind closed doors. But a quiet tension clung to him as he reviewed footage frame by frame. He knew too much about how institutions deflect blame, and he knew how quickly truth could become a matter of interpretation once lawyers entered the scene. The next morning, he received a certified notice. Notice of formal inquiry. Alan Mercer vs. Crestline Aircrew Incident Review. The heading was sharp, impersonal, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unseen battles. Alan closed the envelope slowly, his reflection darkened in the window pane. He could already feel the coming storm, but he welcomed it. Every truth invites its own storm. How you weather it defines who you become. The moment the hearing began, tension filled the air like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. No introductions, no small talk. Just the gavel's sharp crack against the steel desk, echoing through the glass-paneled federal room. Greg Harlow sat across the long oval table, pale and jittery, his shoulders hunched as though shrinking from the spotlight. His navy blue uniform was gone, replaced by a rumpled gray suit that looked borrowed or hastily pulled from the back of a forgotten closet. Sweat darkened the collar, and his hands trembled slightly as he shuffled a stack of documents he didn't dare look at. Across from him, Alan Mercer remained still, composed. Every inch of his tailored dark suit was precise, every button fastened. He didn't fidget, didn't blink too much, just observed. Beside him sat Victor Crane, his legal counsel, a man of sharp lines and sharper intellect, dressed in understated charcoal with a fountain pen clipped precisely to his notepad. Victor's demeanor was cool, but the undercurrent of quiet readiness buzzed beneath his skin like voltage. The chairman, a square-jawed man with silver hair and a military bearing, glanced over his glasses. "We're here to examine the events aboard Crestline Flight 227, from Valeport to Harlington. Mr. Mercer, Mr. Harlow, and representatives of Crestline Air, please know this panel is authorized to determine liability, misconduct, and safety breaches. Proceed, without missing a beat. One of the airline's representatives, a thin man with a high forehead and forced smile, leaned forward. We'd like to open with the point that Mr. Mercer, though a passenger, initiated a dangerous situation by triggering the emergency slide, an action that endangered crew and passenger safety and violated FAA conduct standards." Victor didn't blink. He calmly reached into his folder, withdrew a printed diagram, and placed it in front of the panel. "Respectfully," he said, his voice smooth, "that assumption is based on incorrect technical knowledge. Allow me to clarify." He walked the panel through the layout of the aircraft's emergency slide mechanism, noting the pressure triggers, sensor response delay, and the override panel near the front galley, one Greg had passed twice during the flight. Then he slid over a second sheet, a maintenance report from 3 months earlier, showing an unaddressed irregularity on the same mechanism. But the turning point came when Victor raised a finger and said, "We will now play recorded footage from the cabin during the final 20 minutes of flight." The room darkened as the screen at the end of the chamber lit up. The video played without commentary. Silence fell as Greg's own actions were laid bare, first mocking Evan with the blanket, then laughing within arm's reach of the shivering teen, then the stumble during the final bout of turbulence. The moment of the slide's deployment came clearly, Greg tripping, falling backward and hitting the release panel with the full weight of his hip. The footage froze on his face, mouth wide, eyes wide, arms flailing, as the slide erupted and wrapped around him like a trap sprung by fate itself. The lights came back on. The panel members sat frozen. Even the airline's legal team fidgeted, their earlier confidence reduced to a flicker of discomfort. Victor straightened his papers. "As you can see, Mr. Mercer did not activate the slide. Mr. Harlow did, albeit accidentally. Additionally, I submit supplemental footage of Mr. Harlow's conduct, recorded throughout the flight." He tapped a key, and a second montage began, Greg ignoring passenger requests, snapping at a doctor, and ridiculing Evan multiple times. When it ended, the silence was heavier than before. One of the board members, a man who had barely spoken, finally leaned forward. "Do you have an explanation for this pattern of behavior, Mr. Harlow?" Greg's mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes flicked from the panel to Alan, then down to the table. The sweat on his brow now traced a trembling path down his cheek. The chairman cleared his throat. "We will deliberate privately." This session is adjourned until further notice. Chairs scraped as people stood. Greg was guided gently out by a federal marshal, though his feet barely cooperated. As he reached the door, he turned, eyes locking onto Alan. In them, a swirl of panic, resentment, and helplessness danced without direction. Alan, unmoved, watched him for a long second, then said in a voice that carried across the polished floor, "You caused your own descent." Truth doesn't always land gently. It lands where it's meant to. The verdict came in on a quiet Thursday afternoon, but the impact rippled like thunder through the industry. The Federal Aviation Board's findings were read aloud in a press room packed with reporters, regulators, and silent observers. The panel, composed of 6 members in Navy suits, sat beneath the seal of the National Aviation Oversight Commission. The lead investigator, Malcolm Drew, cleared his throat and began. Based on the evidence submitted, including surveillance footage, witness statements, medical assessments, and flight records, the panel concludes that Flight Attendant Gregory Harlow is guilty of gross negligence, misconduct, and endangerment of passengers during Flight 227 from Vailport to Harlington. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Cameras clicked rapidly. At the front row, Alan Mercer sat still, his hands clasped gently in his lap, his expression unreadable. Next to him, his legal advisor, Victor Crane, gave a small nod of satisfaction, then leaned slightly to whisper, "That's precedent-setting language." They're not just scolding, they're condemning. Greg Harlow wasn't present. His attorney had cited emotional stress and kept him away from the cameras, but Alan knew the real reason: shame. The footage of Greg sneering, withholding blankets, and mocking a child had spread like wildfire. Social media had dubbed him the ICE attendant. His name had become a cautionary tale, and the union, once quiet, had withdrawn its defense after the technical analysis proved Greg had tampered with the emergency slide panel weeks before the incident. The board continued. Additionally, Kreslin Air is hereby fined $4.3 million for failure to address repeated internal complaints and for maintaining a crew conduct system lacking sufficient accountability. The airline is ordered to implement revised safety and conduct protocols within 120 days. Victor's smile sharpened. They've just been gutted at the foundation. Alan gave no visible reaction. Inside, his thoughts were not of victory, but of responsibility. He had never sought revenge for personal gain, only change. And now, with the system finally acknowledging what so many had endured in silence, he knew the real work was about to begin. The press briefing afterward was scheduled in a federal auditorium lined with frosted glass panels and soft overhead lighting. Alan stood behind the podium, the newly released Human Dignity in Flight draft policy displayed on a screen beside him. The room buzzed with reporters, their hands ready over keyboards and microphones raised like weapons. Alan adjusted the microphone. "My name is Alan Mercer. I'm not here today as a victim or an expert. I'm here as a father." The room hushed. His voice was steady, but his eyes, focused and deliberate, spoke volumes. What happened aboard Flight 227 wasn't an accident. It was the result of a culture where power can be abused behind a uniform, and where the weakest voices are often ignored. My son was cold, suffering, and he was laughed at. But the failure wasn't just in one man's cruelty. It was in the silence that followed his actions for years before that moment. He paused, letting the weight settle. Then he continued. "We live in a world connected by technology, by law, by progress. But connection means nothing without compassion. That is why I'm honored to announce that, in partnership with federal oversight bodies, we are launching a new training and audit framework called the Human Dignity in Flight Protocol. It will require all flight crews to undergo empathy-based training, advanced behavioral reporting, and direct passenger complaint tracking." In real time, applause erupted from a section of the room, quickly spreading. Several hands shot up for questions, but Alan waved them down. He wasn't finished. "This is not about punishing every mistake. This is about building a standard where dignity is not negotiable, where no child, no person, will ever be mocked for asking to be warm." Later that night, Alan returned home to find Evan curled up on the couch, watching an animated news segment where cartoon versions of them were being used to explain airline reform to kids. Evan turned and smiled. "They made you taller," he joked. Alan chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "And you look a lot less cold." Evan held up a thick envelope. "These came for you." Letters from people. Some of them are from flight crews. Thanking you, Alan sat down and read a few. A letter from a junior attendant named Marcus described how he'd once been reprimanded for giving a blanket to an elderly man in economy. Another came from a father who had watched the story unfold with tears in his eyes, remembering when his daughter was denied water on a flight because she wasn't in the right seat class. Alan set the letters down, his thoughts heavier now, not with burden, but with duty. He'd started this journey defending his son, but now it was so much bigger. Across town, Greg Harlow sat alone in a one-bedroom apartment. His license had been revoked. His name was red-flagged in every airline HR database. With no job, no savings, and no defense left to mount, he watched reruns of the hearing on mute, his own face flickering on the screen, frozen in time, a cautionary symbol of arrogance unchecked. The media had moved on, but the consequences hadn't. Alan, meanwhile, declined every interview, every invitation to headline panels. He preferred action over applause. When asked if he felt vindicated, he simply said, "I'd rather be anonymous in a world that treats people with dignity than famous in one that still doesn't." He resumed work at Sky Secure, refining the alert flagging system and advising other airlines now asking for help. One evening, Evan peeked into his office. "You're working again?" Alan looked up and smiled. "Just helping make sure the new systems run right." Evan entered the room, wearing a new blanket, this one from Crestlin's relaunch. It bore the company's new slogan stitched in clean silver thread. Alan read it aloud as his son sat beside him. "Respect takes flight." They sat in silence, the glow of the monitor reflecting off the window as snow began to fall outside. Alan's phone buzzed again, another request from an international airline asking for consultation. He ignored it for now. Beside him, Evan leaned his head against his father's shoulder. For the first time in a long time, the cabin was warm. Yet Alan felt no triumph, only closure. Justice had been served not through rage, but through reason, and that made it unshakable. Alan Mercer did not speak as the plane's wheels lifted from the tarmac. He merely glanced toward the wing outside the window, watching it slice through the morning fog as the aircraft ascended into open sky. The familiar hum of the engines, once a source of tension and calculation, now felt strangely calming. Beside him, his son, Evan, pulled a soft blanket over his legs, a thick navy blue one embossed with the Crestline Air logo and stitched with the company's new slogan in silver thread, "Respect takes flight." It was a strange feeling to be welcomed onto an aircraft not as a passenger, but as a guest of honor. The airline had invited them both for the ceremonial relaunch of their revamped training initiative, a move spurred directly by the events of that cold winter night. Alan had agreed under one condition: no speeches, no press conferences, just a quiet flight to observe, reflect, and evaluate. It wasn't revenge he had sought back then. It was restoration. And now, in this high-altitude moment, he was here to see whether the lesson had truly taken hold. The crew's behavior confirmed it from the beginning. The lead flight attendant, a young man named Derek Holmes, had greeted Evan first, not Alan, kneeling to the boy's level, offering him not just a blanket, but a smile that seemed practiced, yes, but sincere. "If you need anything at all, just press the button." "No matter what class you're in," Derek had said, his eyes flicking momentarily toward Alan with the slightest recognition of who they were. It wasn't deference. It was awareness. That made all the difference. Evan now settled in beside his father, his cheeks no longer pale, his posture relaxed. The shivering teenager from months ago had been replaced by someone slightly older in presence, if not in years. He glanced sideways at Alan and asked softly, "Do you think he ever learned?" Alan didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the faint horizon, where sunlight was starting to paint streaks of gold through the thinning clouds. His reflection on the window pane stared back, older, perhaps wearier, but not broken. "Maybe not," he replied, his voice low, measured. A pause stretched between them, filled only by the soft purr of the aircraft and the quiet rustling of passengers settling in. Alan turned his head just enough to look at his son. But the world did. He meant it. The policy reforms, the rewritten training manuals, the flood of industry consultations his firm had been invited to lead, it all pointed to a shift. Not seismic, not sudden, but unmistakable. His thoughts were interrupted by the gentle vibration of his phone against the fold-out tray. He tapped the screen and scanned the message. It was from his team at Sky Secure Analytics. "Inquiry received, Orbital Air RE, Cabin Conduct Evaluation Request, Potential Contract. Proceed?" Alan let out the faintest breath of a laugh. Another airline, another audit, another chance to turn scrutiny into structure. He tapped a quick reply, "Yes. Schedule briefing," before locking the screen again. The flight had only been in the air 15 minutes, but already Alan felt a peace that had eluded him since that night. This wasn't closure, not fully, but it was movement. It was something like healing. A few rows ahead, Derek offered an elderly man help with his bag. No sighs, no sarcasm, just steady hands and patient words. Alan watched closely. It wasn't just what they did, it was how they did it, and how others observed it. The new motto stitched onto Evan's blanket wasn't just a slogan, it was a standard. And for the first time, Alan believed it might actually mean something. He sat back, eyes softening, and let the hum of the aircraft wrap around him. He wasn't plotting. He wasn't waiting. For once, he was simply present. Somewhere below them, cities and systems churned forward, unaware of the quiet revolution still unfolding at 30,000 feet. Evan leaned his head against Alan's shoulder. Alan didn't flinch. The boy closed his eyes, comforted by warmth, not just from the blanket, but from something deeper, something earned. Alan's phone buzzed again, this time with a calendar update. He didn't check it. He already knew what it meant. The mission wasn't over. But that was all right. He was ready. From a single act of cruelty, an entire industry learned compassion. He thought freezing a boy would be funny. Minutes later, he was wrapped in the emergency slide instead. If you stand for dignity, justice, and accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of cruelty, humiliation, and poetic justice when arrogance meets empathy's revenge. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire kindness, accountability, and respect toward those in need.